Okay, so we're thinking about social factors and how we're going to try and link just some examples and explanations to this concept as well of intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So I am an individual. You are individuals. You have your own personalities, attitudes, and lifestyles, but you haven't arrived at those by chance. You haven't arrived at those like you're not the same person that you were 3 years ago, probably even 6 months ago. We are constantly changing and adapting our sense of self, our personality, attitude, and lifestyles in response to different social factors. Now, for example, if we look at lifestyle, so a social factor that can influence the development of my personality, attitude, and lifestyle is my lifestyle, how I choose to live. So when we think about lifestyle, it's the choices of how we live. Attitudes and beliefs, okay? So there are certain people who have certain attitudes. Currently, if we take our current situation towards COVID, I was speaking to somebody who believes it's all a conspiracy myth. There is no COVID. Their attitude, their belief around this is completely different to my own. So we would be at odds, but that person's personality, their lifestyle choices, what they listen to, what they read on social media and in the news has led them to develop the attitude and the belief that COVID doesn't exist. Some people's attitudes and beliefs, we could talk about it. Some people believe that the treatment of animals is inhumane in the preparation of meat. So they've chosen an attitude and a belief and a lifestyle of vegetarianism. So these elements start to overlink. Now, demographics is one of the traditional ways we used to determine your social position. So when we talk about demographics, it's the very seemingly factual things. It's your age. So under demographics, we can make the note that it's your age, it's your gender, okay? It can be your occupation as part of your demographic profile, your income, if you're an earner. If you're a student, demographically, it's interesting because you're often demographically placed alongside the unemployed because you have no income. But we could argue that a student and unemployed people actually would have very different lifestyles. As a student, potentially you still have access to privilege, to nicely bought things because your parents might be quite wealthy. Okay? Because my mum was a single parent and semi-employed, so like part-time worker, my early experiences of life, my early lifestyle was one where we didn't have lots of money. I was on free school dinners. I didn't have lots of money, but it wasn't because my mum was unemployed. It was because of certain circumstances that just contributed to that. So when we think about demographics, they can be very like hard and fast. You're either male or female. Your age is fixed. Your job is fixed. Your income's fixed. But actually, all these other things, and that's why we've got the link line in this example, in this image, just shows that they are all interlinked, really. So your demographics, age, gender, occupation, income, okay? And potentially your class, whether you would identify or be identified as working class, middle class, or upper class. Now, education. Now, education is one of those determining factors, okay, that would have had an impact on your personality, attitude, and lifestyle. Now, there's not going to be one person in this class that is not being in education. But if we were going back to an older demographic, to potentially your grandparent generation or your great-grandparent generation, actually their experience of education would be incredibly different. Some of them might have been more sporadic, sometimes going to school, sometimes not. Some of them would have had big periods of education interrupted by the war. So we see that education can be different for different people. But what we want to ask ourselves is, in terms of education, has a person completed the first stage of education, in other words, primary and secondary school? That would be one marker. So if you've left education with a set of GCSE grades and results, that's 1 degree of education. We then recognise that we can go on into further and higher education. Now, you'll remember I will use blood brothers during this topic a few times because it'll be probably the most familiar anchor point you might have for some of these bigger ideas. So we recognise that education can be indicative of a privileged or prestigious background. So going to certain types of higher education, your Oxfords, your Cambridges, going to the Russell Group universities. Okay, so even if we've got 10 people that all go to higher education, even within that group, there'll be some that are marked out as being more elite, more academic than others. Now, I'm not saying that's fair, but that's true. So we've got higher education, university. We've got further education, which is college to get your A levels. And we've got the comprehensive education system, which is really in this country now, everybody should be in education up until the age of 18. Now, we know that's our way of doing things, but actually, if you were talking to somebody from a different culture, their education experiences might be very different. So again, it's having an impact on your personality, your attitude, and your lifestyle. Now, if we just start to link some of these again, there are some people who believe that education is absolutely vitally important to your success. I believe that. I'm an educator because I absolutely believe that everybody is entitled to the best possible education, and the education is absolutely a catalyst to securing not success in the sense of monetary success, but in terms of maybe happiness and enabling you to go where you want to go in life. So for me, I'm a big believer in education. Some people's attitudes towards education is really negative. They hated school. They don't believe in the value of education. They believe that education is getting it wrong, that the way we're teaching children. So we can just begin to see how these elements overlap. Yeah. Now, we could say that education and social mobility are linked. Now, social mobility refers to this concept of being socially mobile, that you are not fixed. Your social position, your social status is not a fixed thing, that you can demonstrate social mobility that through education, so through completing certain degrees of education, or by earning certain amounts of money, or by marriage, you can move into different social mobility groups. So you can be socially mobile. You can change your social status, your social group based on different factors. So some people believe that through the process of education, you can move up a social scale. You can achieve status and privilege within society based on your education. Some people would believe that that can be achieved through money. Yep, so there's economic factors that drive social mobility. So I might not have followed education, but I'm an amazing entrepreneur. I've created something really cool, and I'm rising up through the ranks. Hello, Lord Alan Sugar. He demonstrates social mobility that was outside of education. He earned his way up the social scale, and now he is a Sir Alan Sugar. Marriage, it's a very old-fashioned idea, but you can marry into social groups and social statuses. Everybody loves to think, actually, it's an old idea, but look at Kate Middleton. We look at her later, but Kate Middleton would be an example of social mobility. She moved from a upper middle class background into, by way of marriage, the highest kind of like social status, the social group that we have within our current social system. In other words, she's going to be queen someday. Okay, now ethics and religion can impact on your personality, attitudes, and lifestyle. Historical issues, so the history of this country, our cultural history can have an impact on our personality, attitudes, and lifestyle. And cross-cultural communications. Now, we are what we call a multicultural society. So our personalities, our attitudes, our lifestyles, our experiences, as we communicate with people from different cultures, can change and be impacted. So that's what we really mean by social factors, and that's why it's such a complex issue. It's not one of these that will determine how I use language, but an interplay. Now, the other way that we can be impacted is through this issue of intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. Now, this really means, what do I do because I want to do it, because it's part of my internal drive and desire to do something, versus what do I do because somebody else makes me, because there is an external or an outside push to do something. So if we just look back at the middle of this, education is a classic example. Right now, there are different people through different personalities, attitudes, and lifestyles that come to education with very different beliefs. I am an advocate for education, not because I'm a teacher, not because I love English, but actually because I grew up in a single parent household. I grew up with my mum, and I understood actually how difficult life was for her, not because she wasn't educated. My mum was incredibly intelligent and artistic, actually. She was really gifted. But she just couldn't get beyond a certain point because of other factors. But I saw and knew that for me, if I needed to direct my own steps, if I needed my life to go the way I wanted it, I had to do that by educating myself. So I had this internal desire, this internal drive, this moment of intrinsic motivation where I wanted to do really well at school for me. I knew I wanted to. Plus, I love learning. I loved reading. I loved all my subjects, even the ones I wasn't good at. I never went into one subject and was unhappy. I just loved, I'm just wired that way. Yep, my internal desire and drive is wired to learn. I love it. But I also knew that there were some external outside factors. I loved pleasing my teachers. Confessional, yeah. It made me really happy when a teacher told me I did something well. I'm a classic people pleaser. I'm working hard on it. But if a teacher told me, Amy, that was amazing. What a brilliant essay. What a really good contribution. I love your insight. For me, that made me happy. I wanted to please other people. I wanted to do well. So I had this balance of the internal drive to do it for myself, set against the external push of teachers saying you can do it, which meant I really enjoyed my time in education, and I came out with good GCSEs. I came out with a mix of A's and B's with an A star thrown in there, and I was really happy. Something changed at A level. Oh no, confessional. Okay, I was still driven to do well. There was still a bit of me that really wanted to go to university. But you know what happened, sadly? Got a little bit cocky, a little bit full of myself because I'd done so well at GCSE. So I had this internal desire to do well, but that was actually in conflict with this other desire in me to not want to do the work. I thought it was going to come easy, and I wanted to run off with my friends. We wanted to sit in the park. We wanted to go and drive around and listen to music after school. We didn't. So there was this external push as well, just to do something different. So actually, when it came to the A level, I made a few bad choices and ended up having to work really hard in the end, but maybe missing out on a grade for it. So when we talk about the intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, okay, it's looking at, for the individual, what's the internal desire or drive, what's motivating them, versus what are the external outside pushes. Now, we would argue if you're somebody that you're only doing things because somebody else is telling you, that's a dangerous position. Similarly, if you're somebody that only does what you want to do and you don't care about the outside world, the external circumstances, that can be a dangerous position. So it's really all about balance. So just pause there. For some of these factors on here, just maybe make a few notes. So social mobility refers to class, education, we've got higher education, further education, but just give yourself a minute to add some additional notes to these areas. Okay then, so social groups can therefore be defined as two or more people who interact with one another because they share similar characteristics, attitudes, facts, and experiences from this little group here. So people who have a similar religion tend to interact together. They might go to the same church, the same mosque. People who are in the same education, the same school will interact together. So a social group becomes two or more people then who interact based on these factors. And we recognize that, again, it can become more complex. In other words, individuals interact with different people based on lots of different changing contexts. For example, the people I socialize with because of my religion aren't going to be the people I socialize with because of education. People that I work with are not the same as people I socialize with at home. And there are more complex definitions. So what also begins to happen is, depending on the group I find myself in, the internal and the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations are also going to be different. And sometimes I can find myself in certain groups under a huge amount of tension and pressure versus other groups where there's none. So maybe with my friends and my family, I'm free. There's a sense of integrity and wholeness and freeness just to be me. Whereas at work, I have to conform to certain patterns and expectations. Okay, so what are those more complex definitions? Okay, so from the simple to complex, okay? Individuals interact with different people based on changing contexts. So there are more complex definitions. Now, what we're going to do there is I'm just going to pause this, upload it, and then part C is our final part for today.